Well, the interesting thing about Victoria Nuland is her selective memory. She may have been the U.S. ambassador to NATO at the time, but you saw she said when he said, "Oh, that's when Putin said that if you're going to be a member of NATO, you're going to be a member of NATO without Crimea in the East." She said, "Oh no, that wasn't even discussed at the time." Well, we had another ambassador, Victoria. I think his name was William Burns. You might know him today. He's the director of the CIA, but back in 2008, he was the ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a memorandum in February of 2008 talking about this very issue. It was the "Niet means Niet, no means no" memorandum. And in there, he said, if Ukraine, this is the U.S. ambassador to Russia, writing a report about Russian attitudes. And he said, if Ukraine were to join NATO, that would inevitably lead to a war between Ukraine and Russia. And the consequences of that war would be that Ukraine would, at a minimum, lose Crimea and the Donbass. So Victoria Nuland's a liar, a straight up liar, to pretend that there wasn't any discussion of that. There was. The discussion was between the American ambassador to Russia and the Russian government. It was reflected in a memorandum that warned NATO that if you invite Ukraine into your membership, it will lead to a war and Ukraine will lose, at a minimum, Crimea and the East. So that's Victoria Nuland's selective memory. And the other thing she doesn't talk about, because again, she's just a liar, straight up liar. She talks about Georgia being ready. Well, Georgia at the time was ruled by Mikhail Saakashvili. And I'd like to ask Victoria Nuland, about the 2nd Georgian Brigade, which was trained by NATO and the United States, was deployed to Iraq as part of Georgia trying to suck up the United States and, so that we would allow them into NATO. But at the same time that this was happening, the Russians were in there talking to, this is when Dmitry Medvedev was the president. And Medvedev was sending delegations to talk to Mikhail Saakashvili in the lead up in the spring and in early summer, saying, hey, I know you guys are leaning in that direction, but if you want to get Abkhazia and South Ossetia back, these are two breakaway republics that after 1993 became, de facto independent. If you want them back, I'm willing to talk to you about it. But one of the conditions of bringing Abkhazia and South Ossetia back in is that you can't be part of NATO. You got to be neutral. And Saakashvili was talking to him because remember, it's not just, again, most Americans have no clue. They don't even know where these places are. But in 2008, you're still a decade removed from having 250,000 people displaced from their homes. 250,000 Georgians fled from Abkhazia to save their lives in the fall of Sukhumi in October of 1993. And these internally displaced persons are a huge economic drain on Georgia and a huge political problem because they're in hotels, they're refugees inside their own country saying, we want to go home. And so Saakashvili's talking about how he can solve this problem. Then again, there's tens of thousands that need to go to Ossetia as well, South Ossetia. He's having these conversations. And I think it was Condoleezza Rice flies in late July, early August, and says, I think it's late July, says, you got to stop having these conversations. Knock it off. We didn't train the 2nd Brigade so you can sit here and negotiate with the Russians. You know what you need to do. And Saakashvili went, huh? It's like, one of those, we built this army. What are you going to do about it? You want Abkhazia back? Don't negotiate. Do it. So Saakashvili invaded South Ossetia in violation of a treaty it had with Russia. There were Russian peacekeepers inside South Ossetia who were attacked by the Georgian military as they closed in on Tsingtali, the capital city, killing a number of them. So the Russians responded. This idea that Putin invaded Georgia. Well, Putin wasn't the president. Dmitry Medvedev was the president, and he was actively negotiating with the Georgians for the peaceful return of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It was the United States that flew in and said, scrap that, invade. And he did. And then the Russians sent the 58th Army, I guess it is, down there and kicked the crap out of the Georgians. Some of the Georgian troops did well, but the Georgian army was destroyed in 5 days. That 2nd Brigade had to be flown out of Iraq by the United States back to Georgia. Fortunately for them, they got in too late for the fight, or they would have died too. And then what did Russia do? It moved in, recaptured the rest of Abkhazia because there was this part called Upper Svaneti where the Georgians still had a presence. They just came and swept them out and seized it. And that was the end of the discussions. End of the discussions. So NATO membership is a suicide pill. And we knew it. America knew it. We knew it because Burns wrote a memorandum about it. And we knew it because we saw what happened when we encouraged the Georgians to invade South Ossetia. This perception of Russian weakness is absurd. I mean, that's what led to this. We believe Russia's always weak. Russia's going to back down. We never thought Russia would do this, never thought Russia would do that. And now we're in a situation where Russia's literally kicking our collective ass in Ukraine. Literally kicking our collective ass in Ukraine. Europe is finished. I mean, they got nothing left. I mean, Sweden's sitting there just bankrupting themselves, throwing, their 17th latest tranche of support. Send it all, Sweden. Russians will kill it all, capture it all. That's just the reality of it, baby. There ain't nothing left that Europe can do. As Lloyd Austin said and I think it was the 24th iteration of the Ramstein contact group, there is no single weapon out there that's going to tip the scale and the balance of the Ukrainians. Ukraine has lost this war. Ukraine will not win this war. Everybody knows it. Now the question is, how do we get on an off-ramp? We're in a political year, so we can't act too decisively or look too weak. Unfortunately, between now and the election, then 100,000 more Ukrainians are going to have to die. Scott, that's a lot. Yeah, it is, isn't it? But that's the reality of it. We're going to kill 100,000 Ukrainians to save political face. And then after November 5th, when whatever happened will happen, we'll make the decision. Because Ukraine can't survive this winter. That's just the reality of it. They can't survive this winter. It's going to get really cold soon. There is no electricity. It'll become unlivable in these urban environments. How do you live in a high rise with no water and no gas and no electricity? You can't. So, it's over. It's over. And what is the West going to do about it? I don't know. But Victoria Nuland's the problem. She is a war criminal. You literally are watching a war criminal. She's a lying sack of manure. But that she worked for the State Department, so we know that they're incapable of telling the truth. She invents history. Talk to Jack Matlock. He was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, right up until the very end. I think he left his post in August, right before the coup against Gorbachev. But he was a participant, either directly or indirectly, in all of the negotiations regarding the unification of Germany, etc. Ask him about not 1 inch eastward, James Baker's now infamous statement. Ask him if this was just all, it wasn't real. No, that was formal policy stated to the Soviets that led to Soviet forces being withdrawn from East Germany, led to the unification of Germany. It was all done on the premise that NATO would not expand. And we lied. We've been lying from day one. That's the reality. This conflict is because of a succession of American lies. To itself, to the Germans, to the Europeans, to the Russians, to everybody. We can't tell the truth. We simply can't tell the truth. We're not telling the truth today. We didn't tell the truth yesterday, and we won't tell the truth tomorrow.
Yeah. And here another clip when she's talking about addressing why they couldn't have a political settlement with Russia before this conflict started.
First told by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that both sides were really close to the end, to the successful end of the negotiations, and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson interfered and stopped prevented Ukrainians from signing the deal. And then Ukrainian Representative Arahami kind of confirmed it, that yes, he said in an interview that there was some kind of advice from Boris Johnson to stop negotiating and to win this war militarily. Where is the myth? Where is the truth?
Relatively late in the game, the Ukrainians began asking for advice on where this thing was going. And it became clear to us, clear to the Brits, clear to others, that Putin's main condition was buried in an annex to this document that they were working on. And it included limits on the precise kinds of weapon systems that Ukraine could have after the deal, such that Ukraine would basically be neutered as a military force. And there were no similar constraints on Russia. Russia wasn't required to pull back. Russia wasn't required to have a buffer zone from the Ukrainian border, wasn't required to have the same constraints on its military facing Ukraine. And so people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine started asking questions about whether this was a good deal, and it was at that point that it fell apart.
Yeah.
It was at this point that it fell apart on its own volition. It's not like the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France all jumped in and said, don't do it, don't do it. We won't supply you with any weapons or support. It'll all be over. We'll dump you. Don't do it. And so Ukraine did it. Arestovich did an interview. He said they'd already popped the corks. I mean, it's not like they stopped this thing. First of all, who is the annex secret to? Not the Ukrainians. They negotiated the damn thing. They were aware of it. What do you think demilitarization means? I mean, I don't mean to be too mean to the Ukrainians. They are Banderist, at their heart. The organization of Ukrainian nationalism drives their very essence. But having said that, these are people that came to power because the CIA brought them to power in 2014. They engaged in cultural genocide against the Russians, outlawing the Russian language, starting to ban. We see it carried out today, banning of the Orthodox faith, the Russian Orthodox faith. They committed, literal murder, mass murder against the Russians in Mariupol, in the Donbass. The violence was such that the Russians had no choice but to rise up to defend themselves. The Russians preempted them from being able to carry out similar acts of mass murder in Crimea, and then rapidly absorbed Crimea into Russia. But the Ukrainians are literally their own worst enemies. They lied about Minsk. Again, people, do your research. You do know in 2014 that the Russians did intervene. They don't admit it, but they did intervene decisively in the Donbass. And they surrounded the Ukrainian army in a village in the northern part of Donetsk, and they were going to slaughter them all. Thousands of Ukrainians were going to die, and that would be the end of Ukraine. And Poroshenko, who was the president at the time, begged France and Germany to intervene. And so Francois Hollande, the president, Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany, went to Putin and said, please, 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 pretty please, please, please don't kill all the Ukrainian soldiers. And Putin's military going, we got them, let's kill them. And Putin went, I'm a man of peace. Okay, I won't kill them. We'll do the Minsk Accords. But, we need you to put pressure on Ukraine to, stop this ethnic genocide against and cultural genocide against the Russians. And so conditions were set out. What did Francois Hollande say? What did Poroshenko say? What did Angela Merkel say afterwards? It was a sham. They weren't serious about peace with Russia. They just wanted to save the Ukrainians' ass. But it was a sham to buy time for what? For NATO to rebuild the Ukrainian army so that it could launch an effective attack and push the Russians and the pro-Russian separatists out of the Donbass. Maybe even recapture Crimea. That was the goal. 15-year training program. That's the reality of it. The West has never been serious about peace at all. So this new Western army that was trained, his U.S. Army bragged about it. In 2015 they went in there and they said we trained 500 Ukrainians every, I forget what the interval was, every 50 days or something like that. Here, and they pointed to the training base outside of Lvov. So, and then an arrow went to the Donbass so they can go here and kill Russians. That was it, man. That's all it existed for. It's about killing Russians. The strategic defeat of Russia. wearing the Russians down. That was it. And Putin was aware of this, but he kept saying, I believe in Minsk, 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 until in fact, in June of 2021, when Biden, who still at that time apparently had his mental faculties, flew to Vienna, I think it was, or Geneva, Geneva, to meet with the Russians. He and Putin sat down, and Putin said, look, a key aspect of this, because at that time the Russians were deploying troops along the Ukrainian border, maneuvering around America. You can't deploy your troops on your own soil. Russia was, sure we can. But if you don't want us to, make threatening moves, then Minsk has to be signed. And so at that time, Biden promised Putin that Blinken would turn and get Minsk signed. And so Putin believed him. Troops went back to their barracks. But come fall, when Putin and Lavrov and everybody's sitting down with Merkel and Macron, saying, "Hey, Minsk," I think it was in October, when both France and Germany said, "No, we're not gonna. We can't pressure the Ukrainians on this one." And that's when the Russians went, "Well, okay, that's the end of Minsk. We won't talk about it again." And that's why in December they came forward with something new, which was the draft treaties for a new European security framework that said Ukraine must be neutral. The West wouldn't talk about that either. So the only option that Russia had at that point in time was to preempt this invasion that Ukraine was training. Everybody's like, they were never. What the hell do you think NATO was doing from 2015 up until 2022, guys? Training the Ukrainian army to do what? Play tiddlywinks? Why were they training them in NATO tactics? Why were they reorganize them, train them for up? Why did Ukraine move 60% of its military up to the Donbass in the lead up to the Russian preemptive attack? Because it was a preemptive strike designed to disrupt the Ukrainian plans to use this NATO-trained army to kick the Russian separatists out of the Donbass. That's what happened here. But even then, Russia went in saying the goal here is to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table. The negotiations that Ukraine and the West didn't want to have leading up to the special military operation, we now want. 6 days later, after the initiation, Ukraine was at the negotiating table. Why? Everybody's like, oh, the Ukraine. Yes. Did Russia make mistakes at the beginning of this thing? Absolutely. Did they send guys forward too quickly? Absolutely. Were they surround and kill? Absolutely. Ukrainians got their asses handed to them. Do you know how many Ukrainians died in the first weeks of this war? They were slaughtered. The Russians went in at a 3-1 disadvantage, and the Russians were slaughtering the Ukrainians, slaughtering them. They took losses too. There's no doubt about it. Those are the months where the Russians suffered the heaviest losses of the entire conflict. But the idea that Ukraine was like, oh no, they got wiped out. Their army, that big old army that they were building, taken to the cleaners. And Russia did that to do what? Get Ukraine to go to the negotiating table. And they did. And then what happened? The lead up to the hopefully what would be the final signing ceremony, after everything had been inked, the secret annexes had been looked at. And what was Russia saying? You can't have a NATO trained army on our soil. That's what is in the annex that Victoria Nuland's not talking about. All Russia was saying is all those damn weapons that NATO's been providing you, get them the hell out, because we don't want any NATO connectivity to Ukraine. That's it. Just get NATO the hell off your soil. Nope, couldn't have that. But Russia did a couple things. They had Kiev nearly surrounded. If you remember, there was a period of time in the battle where, they fought some very heavy battles, and they were positioned, and then everything stopped. Everybody's like, well, that means the Ukrainians were beating them. No, the Ukrainians were beaten at that point in time. The Russians had the military force there. Remember that big long convoy that everybody was taking photographs of that was going to thrust in? Didn't go. Didn't pull the trigger. Why? Because part of the negotiation, Russia said, we will voluntarily, as a good faith measure, withdraw from Kiev, from Sumy, from parts of Kharkov. Withdraw to show you that we mean it. And in Kharkov itself, they withdrew close to 40-50% of their troops in the areas that they still occupied there. They needed to maintain sort of a continuity of defense that led to, that linked in with Lugansk. You couldn't just arbitrarily withdraw until the final peace treaty was signed. But they were going to withdraw from there, and they already withdrew many of their formations back. How did the Ukrainians respond? Well, they dumped the peace treaty. Russia was still negotiating with them. Then Ukraine said, we need to get more. We need to rebuild our army. And so that's when the United States in May did the new Lend-Lease, $48 billion. Europe signed up. They started building this new Ukrainian army. But what happened between May and September? The Russians went on the offensive. They said, we'll go to phase 2. They went on the offensive in Lugansk and Donbass, where they destroyed the Ukrainian army, was wiping them out. Ukrainians say the month of June was one of the worst months for them, except for now. Now it's the worst month. But the month of June 2022 is one of the worst months because the Russians were just killing everything that moved. The Ukrainians couldn't, they lost everything. They built up this new army, though, with all this NATO money and everything. And in September, they attacked in Kharkov, where the Russians had already evacuated over 50% of their forces, compelling a precipitous Russian withdrawal, very embarrassing for the Russians. They attacked in Kherson. The Russians were in a very difficult position, had to withdraw their troops off the right bank of the Dnieper River. But then the defensive lines held. That's what Victoria Nuland got out of this. All right. And now what's happened is the Russians have adjusted to this new reality. They've gone into a war of attrition where they've ground NATO down. They've ground the Ukrainians down. And we're seeing it play out on the battlefield right now in the Donbass. It's near total collapse. The Ukrainians are throwing in their last reserves to stabilize the advance of Pokrovsk. Okay, yay, good job. You stabilized it. Again, for all you amateur military analysts out there, the Russians have stopped advancing Pokrovsk. How many days were the Russians advancing to Pokrovsk? A lot, right? They made some big advances. Yeah, you guys know about that, right? Now, when you have battalions in offensive operations, how difficult is it to sustain that? Have any of you ever planned a battalion size, brigade size, division size, corps size, army size offensive operation? You know about sustainability, right? Getting that ammunition pushed up to the front, especially if you're relying upon a 10-to-1 artillery advantage to suppress the Ukrainians. How do you get the fuel up there? How to rotate your forces out so you don't exhaust them. They've been assaulted. Got to do the, passage through lines, get the new forces up there. So you do all that logistic planning. And at some point in time, got to pause for the cause. We do it all the time. Look at our advance everywhere we've advanced in World War II, all the big arrows, whether it be German big arrows or American big arrows or Russian big arrows. Eventually, every offensive runs out of steam and you got to stop and you got to pause. And during that pause, the enemy often reinforces because they take advantage of the pause. That's what's happening. This isn't the Ukraine stopping the Russian advance. It's a pause for the cause. Meanwhile, Russia's advancing everywhere else. And that's just the reality of it. And eventually what will happen is there'll be a breakthrough at Chasiv Yar, a breakthrough at Kupiansk, and that 47th Madura Brigade that was sent down in Pokrovsk and have to be pulled out and sent up there. And once they, deplete their defenses, the Russians go back on the offensive to Pokrovsk and capture that city. That's just the reality of this war. Ukraine can't hold territory. They're being slaughtered. They were pushed out all of the defenses. The Russians broke through the last of the 2014 defensive lines. That's the reality. Kursk, the Ukrainians are pouring more troops. Abdi Aladanov said they got, up to 4 brigades are being sent in. All right. Russians will kill them. They'll kill everything. It's the biggest killing field right now in this war. The Ukrainians are losing everybody. Everybody sent up there dies. All the equipment that gets sent up there gets destroyed. That's the reality of it. Ukraine has lost this conflict. So now let's go back to Victoria Nuland and that little smirk on her face. Do you know how disgusting that is? Her little smirk. This horrible human being smirking about lying and deceiving, about continuing a conflict that should have ended in 2022. Had it ended, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives would have been saved. Tens of millions of Ukrainian civilians would not have been displaced. $1 trillion in economic damage wouldn't have been done. Ukraine would be a modern, viable nation state today. Doing its business. But because Victoria Nuland, there was a secret annex that, wouldn't allow the Ukrainians to have certain weapons. Do you understand what she's saying there? She's defining the existence of Ukraine based upon an annex to talk about weaponry. That's the entire American approach to the world. We can't work with the world unless we're talking about war. We can't function unless we're talking about providing weapons. That's it. That's our currency. That's our language. That's what diplomacy has become. She's a diplomat. I just want to remind everybody. She's a diplomat. She's not a soldier. She's a diplomat. Her job isn't to be talking about weapons and annexes and all that. Her job is to talk about peace and economic prosperity and peaceful coexistence. She doesn't know how to talk about that because American diplomats only speak the language of war because America is a nation state that can only exist if there is a war. The military-industrial complex has taken over the entire fabric of America today so that we are in constant search of enemies, not in search of friends. That's the reality. That's Victoria Nuland.
Yeah. The other point, Scott, right now, they're talking about Ukrainian army, Ukrainian government is talking about the continuation of this conflict to up until 2029. They're talking about, do you think with the current situation, with the current position of their army, are they capable of continuing this conflict, even having everything coming from the West?
I think the answer to that question is Russia. Russia has shown a level of strategic patience that has shocked me. I've been a proponent because I'm a Marine, so I believe in aggressive offensive military operations. I think Russia has been in a position where they could have ended this war a long time ago. But the damage that would have been done, the number of dead, was unsustainable for the Russians. And so they've chosen the form of attritional warfare where they are actually doing quite well. The Ukrainians are very good at mirror imaging their losses onto Russia. You see this time and time and time again. They don't want to say we lost 2,000 guys today, so they say the Russians lost 2,000 guys. I don't know. The Russians are losing men. There's no doubt about it. Putin has said it's a 1-to-5 ratio. Guys, that's a lot. Let's just say for a second that the number of Ukrainian dead is 700,000. A 1-to-5 ratio, that means that Russia has suffered 120,000 dead. Just let that sink in for a moment, people. So let's stop pretending that Russia's not paying a price here. They're paying a horrible price, a huge price. It's a big price, but it's a price Russia's willing to pay because this is a fight they believe in and they're able to sustain. Ukraine can't sustain this war of attrition. So the question is, does Russia want to win this war in 4 months and lose another 120,000 dead? Because that's what it's going to take. You got to steamroll through. You got to roll through the minefields. You got to roll through the defensive barriers. You got to break into the rear. You've got to aggressively pursue, centers of logistics and command and control and take the casualties. You've got to write off battalions, write off brigades, write off divisions and just wipe them off and send reserve forces in. That's how you do big aero operations. Russia doesn't want to do that. Nor